In this video, I do want to spend some time talking about Shado-pan Brewmaster. I've been voicing my concerns with this new hero talent tree here and there over the last few months, but in this video specifically, I want to break down why the tree is frustrating to think about, let alone use. The Shado-pan tree was the first of the two hero talents announced for the Brewmaster monk, and there were obvious concerns from the get-go. But let's walk through this tree, both everything working right and wrong, and just go over my general thoughts. The staple of this tree is Flurry Strikes, a stacking buff that'll deal damage per stack whenever the monk expends 400 energy. The damage from this ability would be considered underwhelming as a standalone damage instance, but it could easily be improved, but more on that later. Anyways, even without testing, most players were quick to point out the issue with the steep cost. This has to be the most passive of passive hero talent options. I'm going to break down the flaws with this shortly, but I do want to walk through the tree briefly because I think it's important to give context. Veteran's Eye grants the monk 1% haste after striking one target 5 times within 2 seconds. This sounds like it would be difficult to do, but it's actually quite easy, especially with talents like Dragonfire Brew, or even more so with Rushing Jade Wind. Haste as a stat for the Brewmaster hasn't really been good in a long time, but free haste from a talent is always appreciated, especially with how Flurry Strike expending is based on energy spent. Martial Precision causes your attacks to penetrate 10% armor. This is just simply a small damage gain, nothing to really note here. Moving down a little bit, we have Predictive Training, which is a very strong defensive talent node, essentially granting a flat 10% damage reduction after the Brewmaster parries or dodges an attack. Since our mastery grants high value dodge chance, every time we're struck, we dodge attacks very frequently, making this almost a flat 10% damage reduction while actively tanking, mostly referring to Mythic Plus. Sadly, this is paired with an extremely weak defensive node, Whirling Steel. Whenever your health drops below 50%, you gain 15% parry and avoidance for 6 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown. Not sure if this is intended more for Windwalker or maybe for PvP, but this is extremely weak, especially when competing with Predictive Training. Vigilant Watch is another node that essentially is just a flat damage increase to both Blackout Kick and our new Flurry Strikes ability. And then lastly, we have two pretty strong talents in the middle of the tree, One versus Many and Efficient Training. These actually both heavily impact the damage of our Keg Smash. One versus Many causes Keg Smash to count as double to Flurry Charge generation, which now actually at the time is pretty useless since they did change the value of the Flurry Charge generation from max health to attack power. On the plus side, Keg Smash is dealing an additional 30% damage. Efficient Training amplifies all energy spenders by 15%, and that primarily means things like Tiger Palm, Keg Smash, and Spinning Crane Kick. On top of that, every 50 energy that you spend reduces Weapons of Order by 1 second. I love all things that provide cooldown reduction, so I'm not going to complain about this. I do have a small tangent here though. This talent actually incentivizes Weapons of Order over Press the Advantage pretty heavily, and when we look at Master of Harmony tree, Overwhelming Force actually does the same thing. So I hope they implement some way to make Press the Advantage actually competitive again, but part of me feels like it was a band-aid talent until they reduced the button bloat. The last decent node is right here. We have Protect and Serve, which increases all self-Vivify healing by 30%, which is actually quite potent. Blizzard has made some great changes to Vivify for the Brewmaster going to the War Within, so most likely this is going to be the talent we end up choosing. It's worth mentioning that the other choice on this node is Lead from the Front. This actually heals Brewmaster for 20% of all the damage that Chi Burst, Chi Wave, and Expel Harm does. Don't get me wrong, 2 of those 3 abilities are pretty horrible, but Chi Burst can deal some pretty massive damage in larger pulls in Mythic Plus, so if you prefer not hitting Vivify, and if you just want to hit big damage buttons, this isn't a bad choice, but it's just a little bit more nuanced. Okay, let's now break down what's wrong with this hero talent tree, and what I hope Blizzard fixes or addresses in the upcoming weeks. First, we have Flurry Strikes. It's easy to look at the individual damage profile of this ability and say it needs a buff, basically for damage, but I don't think that's going to ever fix anything. We need to look at this passive in conjunction with the rest of the talents in this tree that I haven't really covered yet. There's a choice node that increases the critical strike chance of Flurry Strikes by 15%, which competes with an Execute style talent that causes enemies who were recently affected by Flurry Strikes to explode, dealing physical damage to nearby enemies who aren't currently crowd controlled. The main issue with this talent is how small that window actually is. You're proccing Flurry Strikes every 30 seconds or so, and that debuff lasts for 5 seconds. They have to die within that window, and that's assuming that other things in the pool aren't also going to die at that same time. Another fairly problematic talent is actually Against All Odds. This causes Flurry Strikes to increase your agility by 1% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 20 times. The most stacks you can ever accumulate is 10, and you can't possibly expend more Flurry Strikes within those 6 seconds, making the 20 stacks per tooltip completely irrelevant. The agility increase is fine, and I don't really care to advocate for a higher uptime on up to a 20% agility increase because that's pretty powerful, but the tooltip doesn't really match with how Flurry Strikes is currently implemented in game. At least change the tooltip because 20 stacks implies it's possible to either maintain or at least achieve for that short period. Lastly, we have Wisdom of the Wall, which is the capstone. When 10 stacks of Flurry Strikes are expended, you basically proc one of 4 effects, and generally they rotate through, starting with critical strike damage increased by 30%. This effect is fine, not going to really complain about it, though it's only going to become more powerful as the expansion progresses and the secondary stats that we have available to our character increases. The second effect is dodge and crit strike increased by 25% of your versatility. On beta currently I have 20% verse, which means a 5% dodge and crit chance increase. Again, it's a powerful passive that has an okay uptime. The next two buffs though are pretty much laughable in their current state. The next buff is Flurry Strikes deals additional shadow damage to basically all uncontrolled enemies within 6 yards. The only way to actually benefit from this damage is to proc Flurry Strikes while the buff is active, which right now is near impossible for multiple reasons. Not only is it due to the high energy amount needed to expend, but our 4-set bonus grants free keg smashes, which actually doesn't count towards the total amount of energy spent, which slows down the rate at which we proc Flurry Strikes. I'm hoping that this is a bug, but it's been reported countless times since basically the start of beta, and it's still yet to be fixed. If they actually fix this and we're able to spend the Flurry Strike charges while the buff is active, it would actually increase the Flurry Strike damage by 33%, which is really nothing to scoff at. Lastly is actually the increase of our mastery by 25%. This refers to a raw numerical value and not a direct percentage, which means that if you have 2000 mastery, you're going to gain 500 mastery during this uptime of this proc, which is roughly 1.3% mastery, which is pretty much ass for a buff that can have like even higher uptime. That's essentially 1% attack power and 1% more chance to dodge on after being struck by an attack. What's also odd about this tree is that it doesn't really incentivize just 1 or 2 stats like we commonly see with other classes, but it actually wants you to have enough haste to be able to spend as much energy as possible. It also wants you to have a high crit chance. You also want high verse to benefit your high crit chance and dodge chance, and you want to stack mastery to benefit from the mastery buff. And if you decide to stack one stat over the others, you're actively hurting other elements of the tree. So it's like just a contradicting tree with itself. Also, this early on in the expansion, our secondary stats are generally pretty low, and actually as low as they're ever really going to be over the course of the next 2 years. Anyways, that's a lot of kind of complaining, so let's talk about solutions. Or at least what I'm hoping that Blizzard is going to implement or maybe fix. First and foremost, fix the tier set. Currently, it's like just munching our energy count, which is just not good for how Shado-pan actually wants to work. And we're going to assume it's a bug. So besides that bug, the easiest way I think that Blizzard could remedy this is by reducing the total energy cost amount required to actually expend your flurry charges. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think reducing it from 400 to 300 would be like the sweet spot. As of right now, it takes about 30 seconds to expend 400 energy. On average, I'm not accounting for things like lust or power infusion or any of those kind of external factors. Getting Flurry Strikes to proc every 20 seconds would not only fix the issue with high impact, but would also give more functionality to the Wisdom of the Wall shadow damage buff, which is naturally going to increase both Flurry Strike damage because we're going to be proccing them more often, but it's then going to give us another secondary damage profile, which is the shadow damage aspect. Naturally, this would give us also slightly higher uptime on the against all odds agility buff. If they do this, I think it would fix some of the more inherent flaws with the hero talent. Then at this point, they could easily adjust the amount of flurry damage strikes by either tuning the numbers up or down. They could also take an approach of increasing the uptime of Wisdom of the Wall buff by like 10 seconds, so from 20 to 30, or even a permanent buff that rotates every time you proc flurry strikes. I think that would be fine. The issue with this talent is that the initial buff takes 25 seconds to actually get rolling, making the start of combat feel kind of clunky or slow, and this is going to happen whether it's a key or a raid. Not that the Wisdom of the Wall buff is like necessarily strong and game-changing, but you are missing out on that at the start of combat. There are still some issues that I would like to see addressed, mostly regarding like the mastery component of Wisdom of the Wall. Even if you stack mastery, 25% effectiveness is just way too low until late in the expansion. I know it would be much more boring, but they should just make it like a flat amount, either a flat percentage or a flat value, like 3000 or 10% mastery or something along those lines. In quick summary, Blizzard needs to fix the tier set, detracting from the energy spent counts, and they need to increase the proc rate of flurry strikes. If they address these two things, I believe Shado-pan is actually going to be extremely rewarding as a hero talent. Briefly, I do want to mention again that many of the passives like efficient training, predictive training, they're very, very powerful. And I don't want the issues to be overshadowed by I don't want the issues of this tree to overshadow how strong these things are. It's just incomplete, and I would hate for it to go live in this type of state. Anyways, let me know what you guys think and tell me how wrong I am in the comments below. And of course, a massive shout out to all my Patreon supporters because without them, content like this wouldn't exist. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.